Marcus Turner worked two jobs, mopping floors in a corporate office by day and cleaning a lawyer's mansion by night. He barely slept, barely spoke, because all he cared about was his pregnant wife, who needed emergency surgery. But when Marcus asked his wealthy boss for the wages he was owed, the man didn't even blink. "Not my problem," he said, and walked away. But what that arrogant lawyer didn't realize is that someone was listening. That night, while Marcus silently cleaned the mansion, he was being watched, not by security, but by Mr. Wallace, a respected black attorney who saw the pain Marcus tried to hide. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Within 48 hours, Wallace filed a lawsuit, contacted the labor board, and leaked the story to the press. Suddenly, headlines exploded. Lawyer sued for stealing from janitor. The company was fined 6 figures. Marcus got every dollar he earned and more. And that baby he worked so hard to protect, he named him Wallace. Because in a world that tried to keep him invisible, Marcus found his voice and someone powerful enough to help him use it. If you believe in justice for the underdog, hit subscribe. These stories aren't just drama, they're a warning. Never underestimate the janitor. Marcus stood at the entrance of the mansion, his back aching from a long shift. His shoes, worn and scuffed, made a soft sound against the polished floors as he walked in. The place was almost eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made every step feel heavier, like the silence was pressing down on him. It was well past midnight, but the mansion was still immaculate, just like it always was when Marcus cleaned. He'd learned to move efficiently, his motions automatic after years of working here. This job wasn't his dream, but it paid the bills. Well, part of them. He paused for a moment, staring at the grand chandelier hanging in the foyer. He remembered the first time he walked into the place. He'd been intimidated then, eyes wide at the marble floors and the pristine walls that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Now it was just part of the routine, a job. It wasn't enough, though. Nothing ever felt enough, not when his mind was constantly preoccupied with everything else. His wife, the bills again. It was always the bills. Marcus sighed and reached for the mop, his hands stiff from the cold night air. His thoughts were still on the hours of work ahead, knowing that in a few short hours, he would be on the clock again at the corporate office. That job paid better, but it was also more demanding. By the time he finished there, his body would be sore and his mind would be spent. He wondered, not for the first time, if there was more for him, a better life, a better future. But the truth was, he didn't have time to think about that. Time, like everything else, was slipping away. His wife was pregnant with their first child, and the clock was ticking down fast. He didn't know how he was going to make it all work, but he had to. He had no choice. Marcus took a deep breath, gathering the strength to keep going. His mind was already on the next task, but as he scrubbed the same spot for the third time, he realized he wasn't focused. His thoughts kept drifting, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. Something was going to break. Something was already broken. But he kept working, because what else could he do? The ringing phone jolted Marcus from his weary thoughts. He had been pacing the floors of the corporate office building, absent-mindedly mopping up a spill near the break room, when his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email or a reminder. It was a message from his wife, Tasha. "Emergency, come now." His stomach dropped. His hands went cold. He'd been expecting a call, of course. Tasha was due to give birth any day now. But this message hit harder than he anticipated. The word emergency screamed at him, and the sense of dread crept up his spine like a cold shiver. Marcus quickly grabbed his bag, leaving the mop behind without a second thought. His mind raced with frantic thoughts as he hurried out of the building. His heart beat harder with each step, his shoes slapping against the pavement as he rushed to his car. The street seemed emptier than usual, as though the world was holding its breath along with him. He tried to focus, tried to tell himself it would be okay, but the unease gnawed at him. Something was wrong, something more than the usual worries. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. Every red light seemed like an eternity. Every turn made his stomach twist tighter. When he finally arrived, the panic in his chest seemed to double. He ran into the emergency room, eyes scanning desperately for Tasha. A nurse caught his eye and quickly guided him to the right room. There, lying on the bed, was his wife, pale, sweating, eyes wide with pain. A machine beside her beeped frantically, keeping time with the rapid beat of Marcus's heart. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Tasha's lips parted, but she couldn't answer. The pain was too much. The doctors were moving around the room, prepping her for surgery. "We need to get her into surgery right away," one of the doctors said, barely glancing at him as they rushed her out of the room. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the world around him a blur of frantic voices and flashing lights. His chest tightened. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the bills, the worry, the helplessness. "Please," he whispered to the air, "please let her be okay." Hours felt like days. The sterile hospital room was a blur of white walls and flashing lights. Marcus stood by Tasha's side, holding her hand, trying to stay calm while the doctors worked to stabilize her. She was barely conscious, her face pale, sweat beading on her forehead. The weight of the situation pressed on Marcus like 1,000 pounds, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold it together. He had been pacing, asking questions, desperate for some kind of answer, when the surgeon finally approached. "We've done everything we can," the doctor said in a soft, distant voice, "but she'll need surgery. It's the only way to save her, and it's going to be expensive." Marcus nodded, though his heart skipped a beat. Expensive? How expensive? He didn't have the money, not nearly enough. He had no idea what he was going to do, but he couldn't let Tasha slip away. He couldn't let their baby die before it even had a chance to live. The words expensive echoed in his mind as he left the hospital room. He needed money, fast. There was only one person he could think of who could help him, his boss, Mr. Clayton, the wealthy lawyer who paid him barely enough to cover rent, but who, at least, owed him the wages he'd been begging for weeks. Marcus had been patient, but this was different. This wasn't about bills anymore. This was life or death. He drove to the lawyer's mansion, his mind racing with the possibilities. Could he really ask for that kind of money? What would Clayton say? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had no choice. When Marcus walked into Mr. Clayton's office, the arrogant lawyer barely looked up from his desk. "What is it, Marcus?" he asked, his voice dismissive, barely acknowledging his employee. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Clayton," he began, his voice low but steady, "my wife is in critical condition. She needs surgery, and I need my wages now." Clayton didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. "I'm afraid that's not my problem," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the air like ice. "You'll get paid when I say you get paid. Your situation is unfortunate, but that's not my concern." Marcus felt his world shatter in that moment. His hands trembled, the words catching in his throat. He tried to plead again, but Clayton just shook his head. "You're lucky to even have a job. Now get out of my office." The door slammed shut behind Marcus as he left, his stomach twisted into knots. He had nothing left. No money, no options. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like a crushing weight. But even so, he knew he couldn't give up. Not now, not when everything was at stake. The weight of Clayton's words echoed in Marcus's mind long after he had left the lawyer's mansion. He sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of disbelief and anger, mixed with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. How could Clayton be so cold? How could he just walk away when a life, his wife's life, was hanging in the balance? The car idled in the parking lot of the hospital for a long time before Marcus finally moved. The engine hummed softly, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He wanted to scream, to rage against the world, but he couldn't. He had to keep it together, for Tasha, for their baby. The only thing that mattered now was getting them the help they needed, but he had nothing left. He had nothing. He wiped his face with his hands, eyes burning from the lack of sleep. It felt like he'd been awake for days, caught in an endless cycle of work and worry. But now more than ever, he realized how close he was to losing it all. Tasha was fighting for her life. Their baby was struggling to survive. and all Marcus had to offer them was a handful of broken promises and unpaid wages. Tasha's face flashed in his mind, pale and weak, her eyes filled with fear. His chest tightened, and he forced himself to breathe, to think. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let their child down. But how? How was he supposed to fix this? How was he supposed to make it all right when the system was rigged against him? Marcus's hands began to shake as he sat in the car. There was no way he could keep pretending everything was okay. No way he could keep grinding away without ever getting ahead. He had spent his whole life being overlooked, treated like he didn't matter, like his struggles weren't worth anyone's time. It had been this way for as long as he could remember, but not anymore. Maybe he couldn't change the world all at once, but he could start with Clayton. The thought of standing up to him, of forcing him to face the consequences of his actions, made something stir inside Marcus. He wasn't going to let the system win. Not this time. He couldn't. Marcus took a deep breath, his determination hardening. He wasn't going to wait for someone else to save him. He was going to do it himself. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he had a chance. The next morning, Marcus barely slept. He had stayed up the entire night, running through a dozen scenarios in his head. Every thought came back to one simple question. How? How was he supposed to get Clayton to pay up? He needed help, desperately, but who could he turn to? He couldn't trust his boss, and the hospital was already stretching every penny they had just to keep Tasha alive. He felt like he was trapped in a never-ending loop of bad choices, each one leading to more despair. As he stumbled through the front door of the mansion, ready to start his shift, Marcus had no idea what he was about to walk into. He had resigned himself to another long day of scrubbing floors and wiping down counters, trying to keep his mind focused on the job. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavy, as if the entire mansion was holding its breath. That's when he saw him, Mr. Wallace, the attorney who worked alongside Clayton, standing in the foyer, arms crossed. Marcus froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of the situation. Wallace was a sharp, private man, one of the few people in the legal world who commanded respect from Clayton. They rarely spoke, but Marcus had overheard the lawyer mention his name during the few times he'd been in the office. Wallace was known to be quiet but incredibly intelligent. Marcus had never been sure what to think of him, but right now he didn't have time for second-guessing. "Marcus," Wallace said, his voice calm but firm, "I know what happened yesterday. I know about your wife." The words caught Marcus off guard. How could Wallace possibly know? Had Clayton told him? Before he could react, Wallace stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I also know that you've been trying to get what's owed to you. It's not right," Wallace continued, "and it's time someone did something about it." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had always assumed the wealthy and powerful were untouchable. But here was someone who could easily turn his back on Marcus, saying he wanted to help. "I'm not asking for charity," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "I'm asking for what's mine." Wallace gave a small nod as though he already knew what Marcus meant. "I'm not giving you charity. I'm giving you justice." The weight of those words hit Marcus like a freight train. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope began to grow inside him. Someone was on his side. Someone who had the power to change everything. But Marcus couldn't help but feel skeptical. How could he trust Wallace? And what would it cost him? "I'm not going to sit around while people like Clayton get away with this," Wallace added, his eyes narrowing. "You've been treated like you don't matter, but you do. We'll make sure everyone knows that." The fire inside Marcus flared. He wasn't alone anymore. The fight wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Marcus. Wallace had kept his word, reaching out to his network and moving quickly. Marcus couldn't believe the pace at which things were unfolding. It was hard to wrap his mind around the idea that someone, especially someone as powerful as Wallace, was standing up for him. Marcus had spent most of his life fighting just to keep his head above water, and now, with the help of a complete stranger, it felt like the tide was finally turning. But it wasn't just the legal moves Wallace was making behind the scenes that had Marcus on edge. No, it was the way Wallace had insisted they go public with their fight. As much as Marcus wanted to just get the money and move on, Wallace knew that the only way to truly hit Clayton where it hurt was to expose him, to make sure the world knew what kind of man he really was. The very thought of people knowing the details of his struggle, his desperate situation, made Marcus cringe. But Wallace had a point. If Clayton's reputation was damaged, it would hit him harder than any legal action ever could. It was the media angle that worried Marcus the most. He'd seen stories before, stories about poor people fighting back. But most of the time, those stories didn't end well. People were forgotten. The rich stayed rich. And yet here Marcus was, about to step into the spotlight, hoping the truth would be enough to tip the scales in his favor. The first article hit late one night, shocking in its boldness. Local lawyer's employee accuses him of wage theft, takes fight to court. The headline alone was enough to make Marcus's stomach twist. The piece wasn't just about the stolen wages. It was about Clayton's history of exploiting workers, of mistreating the very people who made his success possible. And the cherry on top? There was a quote from Marcus himself, explaining just how much Clayton's refusal to pay had cost him and his family. Marcus read the article over and over. It felt surreal. He hadn't expected to see his name in print, certainly not for something like this. But the worst part, the part that made his chest tighten, was the sense of inevitability creeping in. Would Clayton retaliate? Would this only make things worse? The next morning, Wallace called him, his voice calm but determined. The media's on your side now. This is bigger than just you and Clayton. People are watching. Marcus swallowed hard. What if it isn't enough? It will be, Wallace replied, confident. Trust me, we've only just begun. And suddenly it was real. There was no turning back now. Marcus had no idea where this fight would lead, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The morning after the article broke, Marcus woke up to a flood of phone calls. Most of them were from reporters eager to get more details about the case. Some were from friends and family, congratulating him for finally standing up for himself, while others were filled with skepticism, questioning what would really come of it. There was one voicemail in particular that made Marcus's stomach churn. This is Clayton's office. You'd better take down that story or things will get difficult. Don't make us regret this. The threat in the message hung over Marcus all day. He didn't know what Clayton had planned, but he could feel the tension in the air. The weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing hour, the pressure of knowing that the fight was no longer just about money. This was about something bigger, something that went beyond his family and their survival. It was about power, and Marcus had just made himself a target. As if on cue, the news picked up speed. A local TV station ran a segment on the lawsuit, followed by a scathing response from Clayton's legal team. They called Marcus's claims exaggerated and a desperate attempt to shift blame. The headlines began to twist. Janitor accuses wealthy lawyer in alleged scam was one of the more benign ones, but there were others that felt like knives in his back. Former employees battle for wages or personal vendetta, they asked. Every time Marcus saw a new story pop up, his heart sank a little more. The media was relentless, and the narrative was starting to shift. What had begun as a story of justice now seemed like a messy, one-sided dispute. As the hours ticked by, Marcus began to feel like the world was turning against him. Clayton had money. Clayton had influence. And here was Marcus, just a janitor, fighting a fight he didn't fully understand yet. The anger that had driven him to act now felt like a heavy burden. Later that afternoon, Wallace called, his tone serious. Don't let them get to you, Marcus. This is the part where they try to make you question everything. They'll do whatever it takes to discredit you. I don't know if I can handle all this, Marcus confessed, the uncertainty seeping through his voice despite his best efforts to keep it steady. I'm not built for this kind of fight. I never asked for any of this. You're stronger than you think, Wallace said. And remember, you're not alone. People are watching. The right people are starting to take notice. Stay focused. The truth is on your side. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it yet. The noise, the backlash, the mounting pressure, it was starting to feel overwhelming. He wanted to retreat, to hide, but something deep down kept him pushing forward. This wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up to the system that had never given him a chance. And no matter how hard they tried to tear him down, Marcus wasn't going to let them win. The pressure was mounting. Marcus could feel the weight of it every day now, on his shoulders, in his chest, like a heavy burden that never let up. Clayton's legal team was working overtime to spin the story in their favor, and the media seemed more than eager to follow along. The insults and threats kept coming. Every article, every broadcast painted Marcus as a man grasping for attention, making baseless accusations. To the world, he was just a janitor, someone who didn't belong in the courts, let alone in the spotlight. But despite the mounting pressure, there was a quiet shift happening beneath the surface. It started small. The first was an anonymous message on Marcus's phone. It was short, just a few words, but the weight of it struck him. "You're doing the right thing." Marcus stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to process it. Who could have sent it? But as the days went on, more messages came. Some were from people he didn't know, offering support. Others were from former colleagues, people who had worked under Clayton, or people who had seen the injustice but were too afraid to speak up. Each one was a small lifeline. Then came the tipping point. Late one afternoon, Marcus sat in his car, parked outside the corporate office building where he cleaned. He wasn't sure why he'd stopped. Maybe it was the frustration of the past few days, or the feeling that the world was closing in on him. But as he looked out the window, he saw something he hadn't expected. A group of workers, all from the office building, gathered together near the entrance. They weren't just chatting, they were holding signs, small ones, handmade, but the words were clear. Justice for Marcus. His heart raced. Was this real? Had the tide really begun to turn? He stepped out of the car, walking cautiously toward the group. As he got closer, one of the workers noticed him and waved. "Hey Marcus, we're with you." The others turned, offering nods and smiles of solidarity. One woman, an older black woman he recognized from the office, stepped forward and handed him a cup of coffee. "We've been following the story. We know what's going on, and we're not going to let them bully you." Marcus couldn't believe what he was seeing. These people who were just as trapped in the system as he was, were standing up for him. They had no obligation to him. They didn't owe him anything. And yet here they were, showing up in the middle of a workday, offering their support in a way that no one else had. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if anyone cared." "You're not alone, Marcus," the woman said. "We all feel the way you do. We've had enough." For the first time in days, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about his fight anymore. This was about something bigger, something much more powerful. It wasn't just him against Clayton. It was all of them, all the people who had been silenced for too long. The workers, the forgotten, the ignored. Maybe, just maybe, they had the power to turn things around. The hope that had been buried deep inside him started to bloom again. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't alone. He couldn't afford to back down now. The day the court date finally arrived, Marcus was a bundle of nerves. It had been weeks since Wallace filed the lawsuit, and every step leading up to this moment had felt like a long, drawn-out battle. The media frenzy had only intensified, with more and more outlets covering the story. Some of the coverage was supportive, but much of it painted Marcus as an underdog, with no real chance of winning against the well-funded, well-connected Clayton. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the media anymore. He wasn't thinking about how the world viewed him or about the insults that had come his way. No, this was personal now. This was about his family. This was about everything he had sacrificed, or everything he had lost, and the chance to finally take back what was rightfully his. As Marcus walked into the courthouse, the weight of the building's walls seemed to press in on him. Everything about the place screamed authority. The grand marble floors, the tall pillars, the people in suits walking with purpose. It all felt so foreign, so out of reach. But Marcus didn't have the luxury of doubt anymore. He had made it this far, and he was going to see it through to the end. Wallace was already waiting for him in the lobby. He looked calm as ever, his professional demeanor unwavering. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Marcus nodded, though the nerves still clawed at him. "As ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom was packed, more so than Marcus had expected. There were lawyers, reporters, and even a few of the workers who had shown up outside the corporate office building in support of him. They were seated in the back, their presence a quiet reminder that this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about something bigger, about all the people who had been mistreated, ignored, and forgotten. When the proceedings began, Clayton's team wasted no time. They came out swinging, trying to discredit Marcus at every turn. They painted him as a disgruntled employee who had an axe to grind, a man who was trying to take down a successful businessman out of pure spite. They twisted every word Marcus had said in the media, every action he had taken, to make him seem like the aggressor. It was like they were trying to make him out to be the villain in his own story. The courtroom felt suffocating as their accusations stacked up, each one more absurd than the last. Marcus could feel his confidence start to waver. His throat was dry and his hands were shaking. But then Wallace stood up. The room fell silent. With the precision of a seasoned litigator, Wallace dismantled their arguments one by one. He pointed out the inconsistencies in their claims, the flaws in their evidence, and most importantly, the blatant injustice that Clayton had inflicted on Marcus. It wasn't just about unpaid wages anymore. It was about a system that allowed men like Clayton to get away with treating others as if they didn't matter. "I want to remind this court," Wallace said, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "that Marcus Turner is not the one who started this fight. It was Clayton Morrow who decided to use his power to exploit an innocent man. And today, Marcus is simply asking for what's rightfully his. He's asking for dignity, for justice, and the law's on his side." The weight of Wallace's words hung in the air, like a truth that could not be ignored. For the first time in the entire trial, Marcus felt something shift inside him. It was a quiet sense of certainty, but it was enough. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, taken advantage of, or silenced. This fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Marcus truly believed he could win. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge deliberated. The air was thick with anticipation, and Marcus sat rigidly, hands clenched in his lap. It felt like time had slowed to a crawl. The hours had bled into one another, and the weight of the entire trial was pressing down on him. His mind kept replaying every moment, every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented, and all the faces in the room. Wallace's confident stance, Clayton's scornful glances, the supportive faces of the workers in the back. It was as if the entire world was watching, waiting for a decision that could change everything. And then the judge stood. The moment seemed to stretch forever, and Marcus could barely breathe as she began to speak. After reviewing the evidence presented, the testimonies from both sides, and the impact of the actions at hand, the court has reached a decision. Marcus held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Wallace's hand on his shoulder felt like the only thing grounding him to reality. He tried to remind himself that they had done everything they could. He had to trust that the truth would prevail, but there was always that lingering doubt, the fear that it might not be enough. The defendant, Clayton Morrow, is found liable for wage theft, exploitation, and unlawful treatment of an employee under state labor laws, the judge announced, her voice steady and final. Marcus felt a wave of shock wash over him. His body tensed as if waiting for a punch that never came. The words echoed in his mind: liable, wage theft. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Marcus didn't hear most of it. His eyes were fixed on Wallace, who was grinning, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Then Wallace turned to him and gave a small, reassuring nod. The judge continued. Clayton Morrow and his company, Morrow Enterprises, are ordered to pay the full amount of unpaid wages, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress caused by these actions. Furthermore, the company is fined an additional 6 figures for their failure to uphold the basic rights of their employees. Marcus blinked, his mind struggling to process the reality of what he was hearing. The weight of it was impossible to comprehend. 6 figures. The words felt like a distant echo, but in his chest, the beating of his heart told him that it was real. Clayton's face twisted in anger, his body stiffening with disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the judge cut him off, her voice firm. This court has spoken. You will comply. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him. He had to fight to hold back the tears to keep himself steady. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been exploited, for everyone who had ever been ignored or dismissed because of who they were. He had stood up when no one else would, and now he had won. Wallace's voice broke through his thoughts. "You did it, Marcus," he said, his smile wide and genuine. "You stood your ground, and now you've got what's yours." For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to smile. It was small, but it was real. A weight had been lifted, but there was still so much more to come. As he walked out of the courtroom, the world seemed different. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was someone who had fought for what was right and had won. And in that moment, he knew that nothing, not Clayton, not the system, not anything, could ever take that away from him.